Hey guys, tonight we're going to put you in the boots of someone who had to rebuild an entire empire from scratch. And not just any empire, but the Western Roman Empire that had been dead for almost 300 years. Picture this, it's 768 AD, and you've just inherited half of the Frankish kingdom. The other half, your brother got it, and he wants you dead. Meanwhile, your kingdom looks like a jigsaw puzzle someone threw against a wall. Pieces scattered everywhere, some missing entirely, and everyone's fighting over who gets to hold the box. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just become Charles, King of the Franks. The good news, you're now the ruler of what would become modern-day France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany. The bad news, your kingdom is about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane, and everyone wants to knock it down. Let's start with the basics. The year is 768, and you're standing in what passes for your throne room in Aachen. The room smells like a mixture of wet dog, stale bread, and that particular medieval funk that comes from people who consider bathing a luxury. The stone walls are cold enough to make your breath visible, and the only light comes from flickering torches that cast dancing shadows like a horror movie directed by someone with a budget of 3 copper coins. Your father, Pippin the Short, yes, that was actually his name, and yes, he was compensating for something, just died. He left you a kingdom that's essentially medieval Europe's version of a startup company, lots of potential, terrible infrastructure. And everyone's trying to steal your ideas. Here's what you've inherited: a collection of semi-autonomous duchies, counties, and tribal territories that are held together by little more than mutual fear and the occasional marriage alliance. Think of it as the European Union, but with more swords and less paperwork, though honestly, not by much. The Frankish kingdom in 768 was like a medieval Wikipedia page that everyone could edit. Dukes were basically running their own little fiefdoms, making their own rules, minting their own coins, and generally pretending you don't exist unless they need you to fight their wars for them. It's like being the CEO of a company where every department head thinks they're actually running the show. But here's the thing that would make any modern politician weep with envy. You don't have to worry about approval ratings or term limits. You just have to worry about staying alive long enough to use the bathroom without someone trying to stab you in the back. Medieval politics was refreshingly honest that way. Your immediate problem isn't just the chaos within your own borders. Oh no, that would be too easy. You're surrounded by enemies who are watching your every move like sharks circling a wounded seal. To the south, the Lombards in Italy are expanding their territory and eyeing your lands like a hungry person stares at a pizza. To the east, the Saxons are conducting what can only be described as a centuries-long temper tantrum, raiding your villages and generally being the medieval equivalent of that neighbor who plays music too loud and parks in your driveway. And let's not forget the Avars, who are basically the Mongols' European cousins, nomadic horsemen who view your settled farming communities as convenient shopping malls where everything is free and violence is the preferred payment method. They're so good at warfare that they've turned pillaging into an art form, like the Michelangelo of medieval mayhem. But wait, there's more! The Muslims have conquered most of Spain and are looking north, with what can only be described as expansionist enthusiasm. They've already made several probing attacks into your southern territories, and let's just say they're not coming to trade spices and share philosophical insights. Now, here's where it gets really fun. Remember that brother we mentioned? Charlemagne isn't just your sibling, he's your co-ruler. Thanks to your father's brilliant idea to split the kingdom in half. It's like being forced to share a business with your brother. Except the business is an entire kingdom, and your brother has his own army and really doesn't like you very much. The Frankish tradition of dividing kingdoms among male heirs was the medieval equivalent of cutting a cake with a chainsaw. Technically it works, but the results are messy and someone's probably going to get hurt. Your father thought he was being fair, but what he actually did was create a recipe for civil war with a side of fratricide. Charlemagne controls the eastern portion of the kingdom, including some of the richest territories, and he's been making alliances with your enemies. Not overtly, he's not stupid. But let's just say that when Saxon raiders attack your lands, they seem remarkably well informed about your troop movements and defensive weaknesses. Here's a fun fact that would make any modern intelligence agency proud. Medieval kingdoms had spy networks that would make the CIA jealous. Information traveled faster than you might think, carried by merchants, monks, and professional gossips who could spread news across Europe faster than a medieval Twitter feed. You're sitting in your throne, which is really just a fancy chair with some gold decorations, looking out at a map that shows your kingdom. But this isn't Google Maps. This is a hand-drawn piece of parchment that's about as accurate as a weather forecast and twice as optimistic. The cartographer who made it clearly had a very loose relationship with both geography and reality. The map shows your kingdom as this neat, organized territory with clearly defined borders. The reality: your borders are more like suggestions. They shift depending on which local lord is feeling cooperative that week, how many warriors you can muster, and whether the local bishop likes you better than he likes your enemies. You control maybe, and this is being generous, 60% of the territory that's technically supposed to be yours. The rest is controlled by local strongmen who pay you lip service and maybe send you some soldiers when they're feeling generous, but otherwise run their territories like their own personal kingdoms. It's like being the manager of a franchise restaurant where half the locations have gone rogue and are serving their own menu, but they're still using your corporate logo and expecting you to handle their marketing. The economy, well, that's a generous term for what you've got. Your kingdom runs on a barter system that would make cryptocurrency look stable. Most people have never seen actual money, and when they do, it's usually coins minted by some local lord who thought it would be fun to put his own face on currency. Trade routes are controlled by whoever has the biggest army that week. Merchants travel in armed caravans that look more like military expeditions than business ventures. And the infrastructure. Let's just say that the Roman roads are still the best thing going, and they haven't been properly maintained for about 300 years. But here's the kicker. Despite all of this chaos, all of this seeming impossibility, you're about to pull off one of the most impressive political and military achievements in European history. You're going to take this fragmented, chaotic collection of territories and forge them into an empire that will stretch from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. You're going to become Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and you're going to do it by understanding something that most rulers of your time miss. Power isn't just about having the biggest army or the most gold. It's about creating systems that make people want to follow you, even when you're not there to force them. The question is, how do you even begin to tackle a challenge this massive? How do you unite a continent when everyone speaks different languages, worships different gods, and has been fighting each other for centuries? The answer starts with understanding that your biggest enemy isn't the Saxons or the Lombards or even your treacherous brother. Your biggest enemy is the very idea that Europe can't be unified. Everyone knows that the Roman Empire is dead and buried, that the age of great empires is over, that the best anyone can hope for is to carve out a small kingdom and hold on to it until someone stronger comes along. But you're about to prove them wrong. You're about to show that with the right combination of military genius, political innovation, and sheer bloody-minded determination, you can rebuild something that everyone thought was impossible. And it all starts with dealing with your brother problem. You know what's worse than inheriting a kingdom that's falling apart. Inheriting half a kingdom while your brother gets the other half and immediately starts plotting to kill you. Welcome to medieval family dynamics, where sibling rivalry meant actual warfare and sharing was just a fancy word for temporary ceasefire. Let's talk about Charlemagne, your dear brother. If you've ever had a sibling who borrowed your clothes without asking, stole your Halloween candy, or tattled on you to your parents, multiply that annoyance by about 10,000 and add armies. That's what you're dealing with here. The problem started the moment your father Pepin died. In his infinite wisdom, he decided to split the Frankish kingdom between his two sons, like some medieval version of King Solomon. Except instead of threatening to cut a baby in half, he actually went ahead and cut the kingdom in half. Thanks, Dad. Really thinking that one through. Here's how the division worked, D. You got the western and northern parts, including Neustria and Aquitaine. Carloman got the eastern territories, including Austrasia, Alemannia, and parts of Burgundy. On paper, it looked fair. In reality, it was like giving two teenagers joint custody of a hand grenade and expecting them to share nicely. Your brother didn't just get territory. He got some of the richest, most strategically important land in the kingdom. His territories included the heartland of Frankish power, the areas with the best trade routes, and the regions that produced the most skilled warriors. It's like your dad gave you a used Toyota and handed your brother the keys to a Ferrari, then expected you both to be happy about it. But here's where it gets really fun. Carloman immediately started acting like you didn't exist. Not in a passive-aggressive way. This is the Middle Ages, where subtle hints are for weaklings. He started making his own foreign policy, cutting his own deals, and generally treating his half of the kingdom like it was completely independent. When Saxon raiders attacked your northern borders, did Carloman send troops to help his brother? Of course not. He was too busy making sure his own territories were secure. When the Lombards started making threatening moves toward your southern provinces, did he offer military assistance? Don't make me laugh. He was probably sharing intelligence with them over dinner. The most infuriating part, your own mother, Bertrada, was trying to play peacemaker. She kept arranging meetings between you and Carloman, insisting that you could work things out like civilized people. Mom, this is the 8th century. Civilized people solve their disputes with swords, not family therapy. Bertrada even tried to arrange a marriage alliance to keep the peace. She wanted you to marry a Lombard princess. Yes, the same Lombards who were threatening your southern borders. Her logic was basically, why don't you marry into the family that wants to conquer you? What could go wrong? You actually went along with this plan for a while, because arguing with your mother in the Middle Ages was almost as dangerous as going to war. But the marriage was a disaster from day one. The Lombard princess, her name was Desiderata, which sounds like a medieval dating app, was clearly more interested in gathering intelligence than being a loving wife. After about a year of what can only be described as the world's most politically complicated marriage, you sent her back to her father with a note that basically said, "Thanks, but no thanks." Meanwhile, Charlemagne was busy building his own power base. He was making alliances with local nobles, promising them better deals than you could offer, and generally behaving like a competitor rather than a co-ruler. It was like running a business with a business partner who's secretly planning to push you out of the company. The breaking point came when rebels in Aquitaine decided to test your authority. Aquitaine was technically part of your territory, but it was one of those medieval administrative nightmares where local lords had more power than the king, and everyone was constantly plotting against everyone else. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover, but with more horses and pointy weapons. The Aquitanian rebels thought they could play you and Charlemagne against each other. They sent messages to both of you, claiming they were loyal to whichever brother offered them the better deal. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy that would have made Machiavelli proud if he had been born yet. Here's where you proved you were smarter than your enemies gave you credit for. Instead of falling for their obvious manipulation, you decided to crush the rebellion quickly and decisively. You gathered your armies and marched south, leaving Charlemagne to explain to everyone why he wasn't helping his brother maintain order in the kingdom. The military campaign was brutal but effective. You didn't just defeat the rebels. You made an example of them. You confiscated their lands, exiled their leaders, and installed your own people in positions of power. It was like a medieval version of corporate restructuring, but with more executions and fewer severance packages. But here's the really interesting part. While you were busy establishing your authority in Aquitaine, Charlemagne was getting nervous. He started reaching out to your enemies, making overtures to the Lombards, and generally behaving like someone who was preparing for war against his own brother. The intelligence reports coming back to you were alarming. Charlemagne was apparently telling anyone who would listen that you were a dangerous warmonger who was going to drag the kingdom into endless conflicts. He was positioning himself as the reasonable alternative, the brother who could provide stability and peace. This is where medieval politics gets really ugly. You had to start considering the possibility that you might need to go to war against your own brother. Family loyalty is all well and good, but when your sibling is actively working to undermine your authority and potentially get you killed, even medieval ethics recognizes that you might need to take action. You started preparing for what looked like an inevitable civil war. You began securing alliances with nobles who might be wavering between supporting you or Charlemagne. You moved troops into strategic positions. You even started thinking about which cities you would need to take first if fighting broke out. The tension was building to a breaking point. Everyone could feel it. The nobles, the church officials, even the common people. It was like watching a slow, motion car crash that everyone knew was coming but no one could stop. And then, in December 771, something happened that nobody saw coming. Charlemagne died, just like that. No dramatic battle, no poisoning plot, no assassination. He just got sick and died. Like people did all the time in the Middle Ages, when medical care consisted of prayer and really hoping for the best. The official cause of death was listed as fever. which was medieval medical terminology for "we have no idea what killed him, but he's definitely dead." Some historians think it might have been smallpox, others suggest pneumonia, and a few conspiracy theorists hint at poison. But the truth is that people died unexpectedly all the time in the 8th century. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if you had planned it yourself. One day you're preparing for a civil war that could tear the kingdom apart, and the next day you're the undisputed ruler of the entire Frankish kingdom. It's like winning the lottery, except instead of money, you got an empire. Charlemagne's death solved your biggest immediate problem, but it also created a new opportunity. His territories, his armies, his resources, they were all up for grabs. The question was, could you move fast enough to claim them before someone else did? The answer was about to reshape the map of Europe forever. Charlemagne's death was like winning the medieval lottery. But instead of celebrating, you had to move faster than a Black Friday shopper spotting a 90% off sign. Because in the 8th century, power vacuums don't stay empty for long. They get filled by whoever has the biggest army and the fastest horses. Within weeks of your brother's funeral, you were already marching into his former territories with a force that was part liberation army, part corporate takeover team. The nobles who had been loyal to Charlemagne suddenly discovered they'd always been your biggest fans. Amazing how quickly people's memories improve when you show up with several thousand armed men. But here's where your story gets really interesting. You could have spent the next few years consolidating power, building infrastructure, maybe working on some internal reforms. You know, boring administrative stuff that responsible rulers do. Instead, you looked at your newly expanded kingdom and thought, this is nice, but what I really need is to conquer some pagans. And that's when you discovered the most brilliant political strategy in medieval history, holy war. Picture this, it's 772 AD, and you're standing on a hill overlooking Saxon territory. The landscape stretches out before you like a medieval real estate catalogue. Dense forests, fertile valleys, scattered villages, and absolutely no central authority to speak of. The Saxons are organized like a collection of motorcycle gangs, each tribe doing its own thing, worshipping their own gods, and generally living their best barbarian life. The air is crisp with the smell of pine and wood smoke, mixed with that particular scent that comes from people who view personal hygiene as optional. In the distance, you can hear the sound of axes chopping wood, and the occasional roar of laughter from some Saxon feast where they're probably drinking mead and telling stories about all the Frankish villages they've raided. This is where your genius shows. Any ordinary king would see the Saxons as just another military problem. A bunch of troublesome neighbors who need to be defeated and controlled. But you saw something much more valuable. You saw an opportunity to combine territorial expansion with religious mission, creating a war that was both profitable and holy. The Saxons were perfect enemies for this strategy. They were pagans who worshipped Wotan, Thor, and a whole pantheon of gods who would make Marvel Studios jealous. They practiced human sacrifice, conducted their rituals in sacred groves, and had a general attitude toward Christianity that can best be described as, thanks, but we're good with our current spiritual setup. From your perspective, this was like finding a business opportunity with a built-in marketing campaign. You weren't just conquering territory. You were bringing the light of Christ to benighted heathens. You weren't just expanding your kingdom. You were doing God's work. It was manifest destiny with medieval characteristics. But here's the really clever part. By framing your Saxon campaigns as religious wars, you automatically gained the support of the most powerful institution in Europe, the Catholic Church. The Pope wasn't just going to bless your conquests. He was going to actively encourage them. It's like having the UN Security Council not only approve your military action, but actually help you plan it. Your first target was the Irminsul, the Saxons' most sacred shrine. This wasn't just a religious site. It was the spiritual heart of Saxon identity, a massive wooden pillar that they believed connected Earth to the heavens. Think of it as their version of the Vatican, except made of wood and surrounded by a lot more human skulls. The attack on the Irminsul was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. You didn't just destroy a religious site. You demolished the very foundation of Saxon belief. You took their most sacred symbol and turned it into firewood, literally and figuratively. The message was clear: your god was stronger than their gods, and you had the military power to prove it. The Saxon response was exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of warrior tribes who just watched their holiest shrine get turned into kindling. They went absolutely ballistic. Warriors came pouring out of the forests like angry wasps, ready to die for their gods and their way of life. This is where your military genius really shines. You'd spent years studying not just how to win battles, but how to win wars. You understood that defeating the Saxons wasn't just about killing their warriors. It was about breaking their entire social and religious system and replacing it with something that would make them loyal to you. Your army was unlike anything the Saxons had ever faced. While they relied on individual courage and tribal loyalty, you had created a professional military machine that combined Roman discipline with Frankish aggression. Your soldiers fought as units, not as individuals. They had standardized equipment, coordinated tactics, and a command structure that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The Saxon warriors were brave, stupidly, suicidally brave. They would charge into battle screaming war cries, swinging massive two-handed swords, and generally behaving like they were auditioning for a Viking movie. But bravery without organization is just a fancy way of committing suicide, and your disciplined troops cut through their charges like a hot knife through butter. But here's where your strategy gets really sophisticated. You didn't just want to defeat the Saxons. You wanted to convert them. Every victory was followed by a choice. Accept baptism and become part of your kingdom, or face the consequences. It was like a medieval version of resistance is futile, except instead of being assimilated into the Borg, they were being assimilated into Christendom. The conversion process was about as gentle as you'd expect from 8th century evangelism. Accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, or we'll introduce you to Him personally. It's amazing how persuasive a theological argument can be when it's backed up by several thousand armed soldiers. You set up baptismal stations that looked more like military processing centers than religious ceremonies. Saxon prisoners would be marched to rivers where Frankish priests would dunk them underwater while your soldiers stood guard. Mass baptisms became a regular part of your military campaigns, like a medieval version of a corporate team, building exercise, but with more drowning and fewer trust falls. The brilliance of this system was that it created a self-reinforcing cycle. Every Saxon you converted became a potential ally against the Saxons who refused to convert. Every village that accepted Christianity became a base for further expansion. Every destroyed pagan shrine became a site for a new Christian church. You were essentially running a religious pyramid scheme, but instead of selling essential oils, you were selling salvation. And instead of targeting suburban moms, you were targeting entire tribes of warrior pagans. The growth potential was unlimited. The Saxon wars would drag on for over 30 years, but you'd already figured out the winning formula. You weren't just fighting a military campaign. You were conducting a comprehensive cultural transformation. You were taking a collection of pagan tribes and turning them into Christian subjects of your empire. Every battle was a religious crusade. Every victory was a miracle. Every defeat was a test of faith. You'd turned warfare into a spiritual exercise and your enemies into opportunities for divine glory. But the Saxons were just the beginning. Once you'd perfected this strategy of conquest through conversion, you started looking around for other pagans who might benefit from your particular brand of aggressive evangelism. The question was, how do you scale up a strategy that's already working so well? How do you turn a successful regional campaign into a continental empire? Building machine. The answer lay in understanding that the Saxons had taught you something much more valuable than military tactics. You know what's better than defeating your enemies? Getting them to fight your other enemies for you. It's like the ultimate workplace efficiency hack, except instead of delegating your PowerPoint presentations, you're delegating your genocide. The Saxon Wars taught you something that would make every modern HR manager weep with envy. The best way to manage hostile employees isn't to fire them. It's to turn them into your most productive team members. You discovered that former enemies often make the most loyal soldiers, probably because they understand exactly what happens to people who oppose you. Let's talk about how this worked in practice. Picture Saxon warriors who, just months earlier, were trying to turn you into a human pincushion. Now they're standing in your army, wearing Frankish armor, fighting under Christian banners, and enthusiastically slaughtering their former neighbors. It's like watching your ex-girlfriend become your best wingman. Disturbing, but surprisingly effective. The psychological transformation was remarkable. These weren't just defeated enemies going through the motions. They were genuine converts to your cause. You'd somehow convinced people who had spent their entire lives hating everything you represented to become your most dedicated supporters. It's the kind of ideological conversion that would make cult leaders take notes. Here's how you pulled it off. Instead of treating conquered Saxons as a conquered people, you treated them as potential Franks. The message was simple. Your old life is over, but your new life can be better than anything you've ever imagined. It was like offering someone a job at a startup that's clearly going to succeed, except the startup was an empire and the employee benefits included not being executed. The key was understanding that most Saxon warriors weren't fighting for abstract principles. They were fighting for their families, their communities, and their way of life. Once you demonstrated that you could provide better security, better opportunities, and better prospects for their children, their loyalty began to shift naturally. You created a military meritocracy that was revolutionary for its time. Saxon warriors who proved their worth in battle could advance through the ranks just like any Frankish soldier. Some of them became your most trusted officers, leading armies that conquered territories they'd never even heard of. It's like promoting your former competitors to senior management positions, except with more armor and battlefield executions. The really clever part was how you handled the integration process. You didn't just throw Saxon recruits into existing Frankish units and hope for the best. You created mixed units where Saxons and Franks fought side by side, learned each other's languages, and developed the kind of battlefield bonds that transcend ethnic differences. It was like corporate team building, but with actual life and death stakes. These integrated units became incredibly effective fighting forces. The The Saxons brought their natural warrior instincts and forest combat skills, while the Franks provided discipline and tactical knowledge. Together, they created hybrid units that were more effective than either group could have been alone. It's like combining the best features of different software programs, except the bugs in your code could get you killed. But here's where your strategy gets really sophisticated. You didn't just want these former enemies to fight for you. You wanted them to recruit their friends and family members. Every converted Saxon became a walking advertisement for the benefits of joining your empire. They'd go back to their villages and tell everyone about the steady pay, the opportunities for advancement, and the fact that their new king actually cared about their welfare. The recruitment process became almost automatic. Saxon villages would send delegations to your army camps, asking how their young men could enlist. It was like running a medieval version of a successful franchise operation, where satisfied customers become your best sales team. You also figured out how to use former enemies as specialists in conquering their own people. Who better to defeat Saxon resistance than Saxons who understood their tactics, their psychology, and their weaknesses? You were essentially turning their own cultural knowledge against them, like hiring a competitor's former employees and getting them to share trade secrets. The intelligence advantages were enormous. Your Saxon soldiers knew which villages could be trusted, which leaders were likely to surrender, and which areas were most vulnerable to attack. They could speak the local dialects, understand the cultural references, and spot deception in ways that your Frankish soldiers never could. It was like having a team of native, speaking translators, except they were also heavily armed and highly motivated. This strategy worked so well that you started applying it to other conquered peoples. The Lombards, the Bavarians, the Avars. Every group you defeated became a potential source of military recruitment. Your army began to look like a medieval United Nations peacekeeping force, except instead of maintaining peace, you were actively creating more territories to conquer. The psychological effect on your remaining enemies was devastating. They weren't just fighting your army. They were fighting armies that included their own friends, relatives, and former allies. It's like showing up to a family reunion and discovering that half your cousins are now working for your business competitor. The betrayal was personal, immediate, and absolutely demoralizing. But the real genius was how this strategy solved your long-term administrative problems. Every conquered territory came with its own built-in management team of former enemies who understood the local culture, spoke the local languages, and had credibility with the local population. You were essentially crowdsourcing your imperial administration. These former enemies became your most effective governors and administrators. They understood the local problems, they had relationships with the local leaders, and they had a personal stake in making the new system work. It was like hiring local managers for your expanding retail chain, except the store was an entire duchy, and the inventory was human lives. The loyalty of these converted enemies was often stronger than the loyalty of your original supporters. They had something to prove, and they understood the consequences of failure in ways that people who had never been on the wrong side of your sword never could. It's like how former smokers become the most militant anti-smoking advocates. They've seen the alternative, and they really don't want to go back. Your army became a melting pot of former enemies who were now competing to show who could be the most loyal to your cause. Saxon warriors tried to out-Christian the Franks. Lombard soldiers went out of their way to prove their dedication to your empire, and everyone was constantly looking for ways to demonstrate their value to the organization. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, the sons of your former enemies were serving as your most trusted commanders. They'd grown up in your system, been educated in your schools, and absorbed your values so thoroughly that they were indistinguishable from your original subjects. It was like running a very successful cultural exchange program, except the exchange was mandatory and backed by military force. This strategy turned what should have been your greatest weakness, governing a massive, diverse empire, into your greatest strength. Instead of trying to control dozens of different peoples with a single administrative system, you had dozens of different peoples helping you create new administrative systems that worked for everyone. But managing this complex web of former enemies, current allies, and potential future conquests required something that most medieval rulers never bothered to develop: an actual system of government that could handle diversity, reward merit, and maintain loyalty across vast distances. The question was, how do you create a government structure that can manage an empire full of people who used to be trying to kill you? The answer would revolutionize medieval administration. Here's the thing about running an empire. You can't personally be everywhere at once, no matter how much you might want to. You need local managers, people who can make decisions on your behalf, collect taxes, maintain order, and generally keep things running smoothly while you're off conquering the next kingdom. The problem is that these same people have armies, fortresses, and a disturbing tendency to think they'd make better rulers than you. Welcome to the eternal management dilemma of medieval kingship. How do you delegate authority without creating your own competition? It's like hiring regional managers for your business, except if they decide to quit. They take their entire region with them and start their own competing company. You solved this problem by creating what might be the most sophisticated administrative system in medieval Europe. A network of counts, administrators, and oversight mechanisms that would make modern corporate governance look like amateur hour. You essentially invented middle management, except with more swords and higher stakes. Let's start with the basic structure. You divided your empire into counties, administrative units that were roughly equivalent to modern states or provinces. Each county was governed by a count, who was essentially your local representative with broad powers to maintain order, collect taxes, administer justice, and defend the territory. Think of them as franchise owners, except the franchise was a piece of your empire and the product was law and order. The genius was in how you selected these counts. Instead of just appointing local strongmen who already had power in their regions, which is what most medieval rulers did, you created a professional administrative class that owed their positions entirely to you. These weren't hereditary nobles who saw their counties as family property. These were your appointees, your employees, your creatures. You recruited counts from all over your empire, deliberately mixing ethnicities, backgrounds, and regional loyalties. A Saxon count might govern a Frankish territory, a Lombard administrator might run a Bavarian county, and a Frankish noble might find himself managing former enemies in recently conquered lands. It was like a medieval version of corporate rotation programs, except instead of gaining experience in different departments, your managers were gaining experience in different conquered territories. This mixing strategy was brilliant for several reasons. First, it prevented counts from building local power bases that could challenge your authority. A Saxon count governing Franks couldn't rely on ethnic loyalty to build a rebellion. He was an outsider who needed your support to maintain his position. Second, It created an empire-wide administrative culture where your counts identified more with your government than with their local territories. But here's where your system gets really sophisticated. You didn't just appoint counts and hope they'd stay loyal. You created an entire oversight structure that would make modern audit departments look relaxed. You established a corps of royal inspectors called missi dominici, literally, those sent by the Lord, who traveled throughout your empire checking up on your counts. These missi were like medieval internal affairs investigators with extraordinary powers. They could review any count's decisions, investigate complaints, audit financial records, and report directly back to you. They traveled in pairs, usually one ecclesiastical inspector and one secular inspector, which meant they were checking up on each other as well as on the counts they were investigating. It was like having a buddy system for your secret police. The psychological effect on your counts was remarkable. They never knew when the missi might show up, what they might investigate, or what the consequences of disappointing you might be. It created a culture of accountability that was virtually unknown in medieval administration. Your counts had to be prepared to justify their decisions at any moment, which meant they had to actually think about whether their actions served your interests. The missi system was so effective that it became the template for royal administration throughout medieval Europe. You'd basically invented the concept of systematic government oversight, complete with standardized procedures, written reports, and regular inspections. It was like creating the medieval equivalent of management consulting, except the consultants had the power to have you executed if they didn't like what they found. But oversight was just one part of your management strategy. You also created incentive structures that made your counts want to succeed. Counties that performed well received additional resources, expanded territories, and preferential treatment in court. Counties that underperformed faced budget cuts, territorial reductions, and the very real possibility of their count being replaced by someone more competent. You turned imperial administration into a competitive meritocracy where counts were constantly trying to outperform each other. It was like running a medieval version of a sales organization, except instead of competing for bonuses, your managers were competing for political survival and increased power. The really clever part was how you handled the revenue system. Instead of allowing counts to keep local taxes for themselves, which was the standard practice and a guaranteed recipe for corruption, you created a centralized fiscal system where all major revenues flowed back to your treasury. Counts received salaries and expense allowances, but they didn't get to treat their counties as personal ATMs. This centralized finance system solved two problems simultaneously. First, it prevented counts from becoming independently wealthy enough to challenge your authority. Second, it gave you the resources to maintain a professional army that was loyal to you rather than to local nobles. It was like having a corporate accounting department that ensured all profits went to headquarters rather than being siphoned off by regional managers. You also standardized legal procedures across your empire. Instead of allowing each county to operate under its own local laws and customs, you created empire-wide legal codes that your counts were required to follow. This wasn't just about maintaining consistency. It was about ensuring that your subjects identified with your empire rather than with their local communities. The legal standardization was revolutionary. For the first time in centuries, a merchant traveling from one end of your empire to the other could expect the same basic legal protections everywhere. A contract written in one county would be enforceable in another, criminal penalties were consistent across territories. It was like creating a medieval version of the European Union. Except it actually worked, and people weren't constantly threatening to leave. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of your administrative system was how you handled succession planning. You didn't just create positions for your current counts. You created training programs for future counts. You established schools where the sons of nobles could learn administration, law, and governance. You created career paths that allowed talented administrators to advance through the ranks. This administrative academy system ensured that you always had a pipeline of qualified candidates ready to take over when counts died, retired, or needed to be replaced for performance issues. It was like running a medieval version of a corporate leadership development program, except the graduates were equipped to run entire territories rather than just departments. The cultural impact was enormous. You created a class of professional administrators who saw themselves as servants of the empire rather than as independent power brokers. These counts developed a shared identity, a common culture, and a collective interest in maintaining the system that had given them power and prestige. Your administrative system was so successful that it became the foundation for European governance for centuries. The concept of professional civil service, systematic oversight, merit-based advancement, and centralized finance, all of these innovations that we take for granted in modern government, can be traced back to your administrative reforms. But creating an effective administrative system was just the beginning. You understood that controlling the bodies and actions of your subjects wasn't enough for long-term imperial success. If you really wanted to build an empire that would last, you needed to control something much more fundamental: their minds. The question was, how do you conquer not just territories, but the very thoughts and beliefs of entire populations? The answer would require you to become not just an emperor, but an educator. You know what's more powerful than the sharpest sword or the strongest castle? A classroom full of 6-year-olds learning their alphabet. Sounds ridiculous, right? But here's the thing about empire building that most conquerors never figure out. You can force people to obey you, but you can't force them to believe in you. For that, you need something much more subtle and infinitely more powerful than military force. You need education. Most medieval rulers were perfectly content to rule over populations of illiterate peasants who couldn't read, write, or think critically about their circumstances. It was easier that way. Ignorant subjects don't question authority, don't demand better conditions, and don't organize effective rebellions. Keep them stupid, keep them scared, and keep them productive. Simple. But you looked at this situation and thought, what if I could create subjects who were educated enough to be useful, but educated in exactly the right way to serve my purposes? What if you could shape not just their actions, but their thoughts? What if you could make them love their chains? This is where you pioneered something that wouldn't be perfected until the 20th century: systematic ideological education. You were going to create schools, but not just any schools. Schools that would produce exactly the kind of citizens your empire needed. Think of it as the ultimate corporate training program, except instead of teaching people to sell products, you were teaching them to sell their souls to your imperial vision. The centerpiece of your educational revolution was something historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. But that's a fancy name for what was essentially the medieval equivalent of a massive public relations campaign. You decided that your empire needed to be not just politically unified, but culturally and intellectually unified as well. Picture this: it's 789 AD. and you're sitting in your palace at Aachen, surrounded by the greatest minds of your age. There's Alcuin of York, your chief educational advisor, who's basically the medieval equivalent of a Secretary of Education with a PhD in propaganda. There's Theodulf, your resident poet and theologian, who can write verses that make conquest sound like salvation. And there's Einhard, your biographer, who's already planning how to spin your legacy for future generations. The room smells like parchment, ink, and the particular mustiness that comes from storing thousands of manuscripts in a climate that's not exactly ideal for document preservation. The walls are lined with books, actual books, not just random collections of scrolls. And you're looking at them like a general surveys his weapons before a campaign, because that's exactly what they are: weapons. Intellectual weapons designed to conquer minds more thoroughly than any army ever conquered territory. Your educational strategy was brilliantly simple: create a standardized curriculum that would be taught in schools throughout your empire, ensuring that every educated person shared the same basic knowledge, values, and worldview. It was like creating a medieval version of Common Core, except instead of preparing students for standardized tests, you were preparing them for standardized thinking. The core curriculum you developed was a masterpiece of ideological engineering. Students learned Latin, which meant they could communicate across your entire empire regardless of their native language. They studied Christian theology, which reinforced your religious authority. They learned arithmetic and astronomy, which made them useful for administration and agriculture. And they studied rhetoric and logic, which taught them to think in ways that supported your imperial system. But here's the really clever part. You didn't just create schools for the elite. You mandated that every monastery, every cathedral, and every major church in your empire had to establish and maintain schools. You were essentially creating a public education system centuries before anyone else thought of the idea. Except your version was designed to produce ideal imperial subjects rather than independent thinkers. The monastic schools were particularly brilliant. Monasteries already had the infrastructure, the books, the teachers, and the discipline necessary to run educational institutions. By requiring them to accept secular students alongside future monks, you created a network of schools that covered your entire empire. It was like franchising your educational system, except the franchise owners were already committed to your religious and political ideology. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had access to education, but only education that reinforced your authority. They learned to read, but they read Christian texts that emphasized obedience to earthly rulers. They learned to write, but they wrote letters and documents that served imperial administration. But they learned to think, but they thought in categories that supported your political system. You created a curriculum that was sophisticated enough to produce competent administrators, scholars, and clergy, but carefully designed to prevent the kind of independent thinking that might lead to rebellion. It was like creating an educational assembly line that produced exactly the kind of citizens you needed: literate enough to be useful, educated enough to be proud of their learning, but indoctrinated enough to never question the fundamental assumptions of your system. The teachers in these schools were carefully selected and trained. They weren't just scholars. They were ideological missionaries who understood that their job was to shape minds as well as impart knowledge. They taught reading through Christian texts, mathematics through examples of imperial administration, and history through narratives that celebrated your conquests and legitimized your rule. The really insidious part was how you made education seem like a gift rather than a form of control. Parents were grateful that their children could learn to read and write. Students were proud to be part of an intellectual elite. Local communities competed to have the best schools. You'd convinced people to voluntarily participate in their own ideological conditioning. The standardization was remarkable. A student who learned to read in a monastery school in Saxony would use the same textbooks, follow the same curriculum, and receive the same ideological training as a student in a cathedral school in Lombardy. You were creating a shared intellectual culture that transcended ethnic, linguistic, and regional differences. This educational system solved several problems simultaneously. First, it provided you with a steady supply of educated administrators who could run your complex imperial bureaucracy. Second, it created a shared culture that helped bind your diverse empire together. Third, it produced local leaders who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in your values and worldview. But perhaps most importantly, it created a class of people who had a stake in maintaining your system. These educated elites owed their status, their opportunities, and their social position to the imperial system that had provided them with education. They became your most effective propagandists because they genuinely believed in the system that had elevated them. The ripple effects extended far beyond the classroom. Educated administrators created more efficient government. Literate merchants developed more sophisticated trade networks. Learned clergy produced more compelling religious arguments for imperial authority. You'd essentially created a positive feedback loop where education improved the performance of your empire, which generated more resources to invest in education, which improved performance even further. The cultural impact was enormous. Your educational system didn't just teach people to read Latin. It taught them to think in Latin, to organize their thoughts according to Roman intellectual traditions, and to see themselves as heirs to classical civilization. You were essentially conducting a massive cultural transformation that replaced local traditions with imperial culture. But here's where your strategy reveals its true genius. You understood that cultural conquest was more permanent than military conquest. Armies could be defeated, territories could be lost, but ideas, properly planted and carefully nurtured, could last for centuries. You were playing a much longer game than any of your contemporaries realized. The proof of your success was visible within a generation. Young people who had grown up in your schools thought differently than their parents. They spoke differently, wrote differently, and even dreamed differently. They saw themselves as members of a Christian empire rather than as members of local tribes. They identified with your imperial culture rather than with their ancestral traditions. You'd achieved something that no conqueror before you had managed. You'd conquered not just bodies, but souls. Not just territories, but minds. Not just the present, but the future. But controlling education was just one part of your comprehensive strategy for cultural dominance. If you really wanted to create an empire that would last, you needed to control something even more fundamental than what people thought. You needed to control what they used to think with. The question was, how do you conquer not just minds, but the very tools that people use to organize their daily lives? The answer would require you to become not just an educator, but an economic architect. You know what's more binding than marriage contracts, more powerful than military alliances, and more permanent than religious conversion? Money. Cold, hard, standardized, universally accepted money that everyone needs and everyone trusts. If you really want to hold an empire together, you don't just need to control armies and ideas. You need to control the very medium of exchange that makes daily life possible. Most medieval rulers treated currency like a side hobby. They'd mint some coins with their faces on them, maybe regulate a few markets and call it a day. But you looked at the chaotic mess of local currencies, barter systems, and regional trade networks that existed across Europe and thought, this is an opportunity disguised as a problem. What you were about to do was create the medieval equivalent of a central bank, a unified currency zone, and a comprehensive trade policy all rolled into one. You were going to turn economics into another weapon of imperial conquest, and it was going to be devastatingly effective. Let's start with the problem you inherited. In 800 AD, trying to conduct business across your empire was like trying to navigate a financial maze designed by someone with a sadistic sense of humor. Every region had its own currency, its own weights and measures, its own trading customs, and its own ideas about what constituted fair value. A merchant traveling from Aachen to Rome would need to exchange currency dozens of times, negotiate different conversion rates in every city, and somehow figure out whether a Saxon silver piece was worth more or less than a Lombard gold coin. It was like trying to run a modern business where every department used different accounting systems, every office had its own currency, and every transaction required a translator. The inefficiency was staggering, the opportunities for fraud were endless, and the barriers to trade were so high that most people just gave up and stuck to local markets. But where everyone else saw chaos, you saw opportunity. You realized that whoever controlled the currency controlled the economy, and whoever controlled the economy controlled everything else. It was like understanding that the person who owns the banking system doesn't just influence the game, they write the rules. Your solution was brilliantly simple: create a single, standardized currency that would be accepted throughout your entire empire. Not just accepted, mandated. You were going to eliminate all those regional currencies, local exchange rates, and confusing conversion systems, and replace them with one imperial currency that everyone would use for everything. The centerpiece of your monetary revolution was the silver denarius, a coin that would become the foundation of European currency for centuries. But this wasn't just any coin. It was a masterpiece of economic engineering that solved multiple problems simultaneously. First, you standardized the weight and purity of silver in every coin. This might sound boring, but it was revolutionary. For the first time in centuries, people could trust that a coin minted in one part of your empire would have exactly the same value as a coin minted anywhere else. It was like creating a medieval version of universal standards, except instead of USB ports, you were standardizing money itself. The psychological impact was enormous. When people could trust your currency, they were essentially trusting your government. Every transaction became a vote of confidence in your imperial system. Every time someone accepted your coins, they were acknowledging your authority. You'd turned every marketplace into a polling station where people demonstrated their faith in your leadership by participating in your economy. But here's where your strategy gets really sophisticated. You didn't just create a new currency. You created a new economic system that made regional independence impossible. Your silver denarius wasn't just money, it was a tool of imperial integration that bound your territories together more effectively than any treaty or military occupation. The beauty of the system was that it was self-reinforcing. Once merchants started using your currency, they wanted to trade with other merchants who used the same currency. Once cities adopted your monetary system, they became economically integrated with other cities in your empire. Once people started thinking in terms of your currency, they started thinking in terms of your empire. You also controlled the supply of silver, which meant you controlled the money supply, which meant you controlled the entire economy. It was like having a central bank with unlimited power and no oversight committee. You could mint more coins to stimulate trade, reduce the money supply to prevent inflation, or manipulate currency values to favor certain regions or industries. The control mechanisms were incredibly sophisticated. You established royal mints in major cities throughout your empire, each one operating under strict imperial oversight. The minters were imperial officials who reported directly to your treasury, not local nobles who might have their own agendas. You standardized not just the coins themselves, but the entire production process that created them. The quality control was obsessive. Every coin had to meet exact specifications for weight, purity, and appearance. Counterfeiters faced penalties that would make modern financial regulators look lenient. We're talking about execution, not just fines. You created a currency that was so trusted and so carefully regulated that it became the gold standard for reliability, except it was literally the silver standard. But currency was just one part of your economic strategy. You also systematically developed the trade infrastructure that would make your monetary system work. You improved roads, standardized weights and measures, established market regulations, and created a legal framework that protected merchants and encouraged commerce. The road improvements were particularly clever. You didn't just repair existing Roman roads. You created new trade routes that connected your empire in ways that served your political interests. Roads that led to your capital. Roads that bypassed territories controlled by potential enemies. Roads that made it easier for your armies to move quickly to trouble spots. It was like designing a highway system that was optimized for imperial control rather than just transportation efficiency. You established standardized market regulations that applied throughout your empire. No more local lords setting their own rules. No more regional variations in commercial law. No more confusion about what constituted fair trading practices. You created a single, empire-wide commercial code that made trade more predictable, more efficient, and more profitable for everyone involved. The legal protections for merchants were revolutionary. You guaranteed safe passage for traders, established courts that specialized in commercial disputes, and created enforcement mechanisms that actually worked. For the first time in centuries, a merchant could travel from one end of your empire to the other with confidence that their property would be protected and their contracts would be honored. The economic integration created political integration. Merchants who traded across your empire developed relationships with merchants in other regions. Cities that specialized in certain industries became economically dependent on cities that specialized in other industries. Regional economies became so intertwined that rebellion against imperial authority became economically suicidal. You'd essentially created a medieval version of economic interdependence that made political independence impossible. It was like building a financial web where every strand connected to every other strand, and you controlled the center of the web. The success was remarkable. Trade volume increased dramatically, cities grew larger and more prosperous, and your tax revenues soared. You'd created a positive feedback loop where economic growth generated more resources for imperial administration, which created better conditions for economic growth, which generated even more resources. But perhaps most importantly, you'd created an economic system that survived the collapse of your political system. Your monetary innovations, your trade infrastructure, and your commercial regulations became the foundation for medieval European commerce. Even after your empire fragmented, people continued to use currencies based on your silver standard, trade routes you had developed, and commercial practices you had established. You'd achieved something that no conqueror before you had managed. You'd created economic institutions that were more durable than political institutions. Your influence on European commerce lasted for centuries after your armies had been forgotten. But controlling the economy was just one part of your comprehensive strategy for imperial dominance. If you really wanted to create an empire that would last, you needed to achieve something that would legitimize all your other conquests. You needed to become not just an emperor, but the emperor. The question was, how do you transform yourself from a successful warlord into the rightful heir to the Roman Empire itself? The answer would require you to make a gamble that would either secure your place in history or destroy everything you'd built. Picture this, it's Christmas Day, 800 AD, and you're kneeling in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The air is thick with incense, the sound of Latin chanting echoes off ancient marble columns, and you're about to participate in what might be the most audacious political stunt in European history. You're either about to become the first Holy Roman Emperor in over 300 years, or you're about to trigger a war that could destroy everything you've built. The thing is, you're not entirely sure which one it's going to be. Let's back up and talk about how you got into this situation. Because what's about to happen isn't just a religious ceremony, it's a carefully orchestrated political theater that will either legitimize your empire or paint a massive target on your back. You're about to play the highest stakes game of medieval politics, and the chips on the table include your life, your empire, and the future of European civilization. The story starts with Pope Leo III, who has problems that make your Saxon wars look like a minor administrative headache. Leo wasn't exactly what you'd call a popular pope. The Roman nobility thought he was a corrupt upstart who had bought his way into the papacy. There were rumors of financial impropriety, sexual scandals, and the kind of political maneuvering that would make modern politicians blush. It was like having a pope who was simultaneously dealing with embezzlement charges, a sex scandal, and a hostile takeover attempt. In 799, Leo's enemies finally made their move. They attacked him during a religious procession, tried to cut out his tongue and gouge out his eyes, and generally attempted to end his papal career in the most medieval way possible. Leo survived, but barely, and he was left with a choice. Either find a powerful protector or prepare for a very unpleasant death. Guess who he called? That's right, you. The most powerful king in Western Europe, the conqueror of the Saxons, the man who had built an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. Leo sent you a message that basically said, "Help me, and I'll help you become something no one has been for centuries, a Roman emperor." Now, this is where the situation gets really interesting. The title of Roman Emperor had been vacant in the West since 476 AD, when the last Western Roman Emperor was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. For over 300 years, the only people who could claim to be Roman emperors were the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, and they were about as popular in Western Europe as a tax audit. But here's the thing, everyone still remembered the Roman Empire. It was like the political equivalent of a luxury brand that had gone out of business, but still had incredible name recognition. People knew that Roman emperors were supposed to be the ultimate authority in the civilized world, the heirs to Caesar and Augustus, the rightful rulers of all Christendom. If you could somehow claim that title, you wouldn't just be another successful barbarian king. You'd be the legitimate heir to the greatest empire in human history. You'd have a claim to authority that transcended tribal loyalties, regional politics, and even royal bloodlines. You'd be, in theory, the rightful ruler of the entire civilized world. The problem was that claiming the title of Roman Emperor wasn't like putting on a fancy hat and declaring yourself king. It required legitimacy, and in the medieval world, legitimacy came from two sources: military power and religious authority. You had the military power covered, but you needed the church to provide the religious authority. And the church needed your military power to protect it from its enemies. It was a perfect match made in medieval heaven, or hell, depending on your perspective. So you marched to Rome with an army that was ostensibly there to restore order and protect the Pope. But everyone knew you weren't just going to Rome to play bodyguard. You were going to Rome to collect on a debt. And that debt was going to be paid in the most valuable currency in medieval Europe, imperial legitimacy. The negotiations were delicate. You couldn't just demand to be crowned emperor. That would look like you were using military force to intimidate the church, which would undermine the very legitimacy you were trying to achieve. Leo couldn't just offer you the crown. That would look like he was selling imperial titles, which would destroy his own credibility. Instead, you both engaged in an elaborate dance of medieval diplomacy, where everyone pretended that your coronation was a spontaneous religious inspiration, rather than a carefully planned political transaction. It was like watching two skilled negotiators hammer out a business deal while pretending they were just having a friendly conversation. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theater. You were attending Christmas Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, ostensibly just participating in a religious service like any good Christian king. The basilica was packed with Roman nobles, Frankish courtiers, and church officials who all knew they were witnessing something historic, but weren't entirely sure what. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Everyone could feel that something momentous was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. It was like attending a corporate meeting where everyone knows there's going to be a major announcement, but no one knows whether it's going to be a promotion or a firing. You were kneeling before the altar, probably praying for divine guidance, or maybe just hoping you weren't about to make the biggest mistake of your life. The Latin chanting continued, the incense burned, and Pope Leo III approached with something that definitely wasn't part of the standard Christmas Mass liturgy. A crown. Not just any crown. The imperial crown that would make you the first Holy Roman Emperor in over 3 centuries. Leo placed it on your head while the assembled crowd erupted in acclamation that had been carefully rehearsed to sound spontaneous. Long live Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans. In that moment, you weren't just the king of the Franks anymore. You were the Holy Roman Emperor, the heir to Caesar and Augustus, the rightful ruler of the civilized world. You'd achieved something that no barbarian king had managed since the fall of Rome. You'd successfully claimed the ultimate prize in medieval politics. But here's where your coronation reveals its true genius and its incredible risk. By becoming Holy Roman Emperor, you'd solved several problems simultaneously. You'd legitimized your conquests, elevated your status above every other European ruler, and created a title that could be passed down to your heirs. You'd essentially franchised the Roman Empire and made yourself the CEO. The psychological impact was enormous. Your subjects weren't just serving a successful barbarian king. They were serving the Roman Emperor. Your enemies weren't just fighting another tribal chieftain. They were fighting the legitimate heir to the greatest empire in history. Your empire wasn't just another medieval kingdom. It was the restoration of Roman civilization itself. But the coronation also created a massive new problem: the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines had been calling themselves Roman emperors for centuries, and they weren't exactly thrilled to discover that some barbarian king in Western Europe was now claiming the same title. It was like having two people show up to the same party wearing the exact same outfit, except the outfit was imperial authority and the party was medieval Europe. The Byzantine reaction was swift and predictable. They refused to recognize your imperial title, declared your coronation invalid, and started making military preparations that suggested they might be willing to fight a war over the issue. You'd gained ultimate legitimacy in Western Europe, but you'd also created a potential enemy with a navy, a treasury, and a 1,000-year-old grudge. The political calculation was brilliant but risky. You'd bet that the benefits of imperial legitimacy would outweigh the costs of Byzantine hostility. You'd gambled that your Western European empire was strong enough to survive, even if the Eastern Empire decided to challenge you. You'd wagered your entire political future on the assumption that being a legitimate Roman emperor was worth more than maintaining peaceful relations with the people who had been calling themselves Roman emperors for the past 300 years. Time would tell whether you'd made the right choice. But in the immediate aftermath of your coronation, one thing was clear: you'd achieved something that no ruler since Augustus had managed. You'd created an empire that was both militarily powerful and politically legitimate. You'd combined barbarian military effectiveness with Roman imperial authority. You'd become not just an emperor, but the emperor. The question was, what do you do with ultimate power once you've achieved it? The answer would determine not just the fate of your empire, but the entire future of European civilization. Here's the thing about being the Holy Roman Emperor. It's like being the CEO of the world's most successful startup. Except you can't IPO, you can't sell to a competitor, and you definitely can't just retire to a beach house in Florida. You've built something magnificent, something that will be remembered for 1,000 years. But now you're faced with the ultimate executive challenge. How do you pass this on to someone else without watching it all fall apart? Welcome to the succession crisis that would make modern corporate governance look like a casual game of musical chairs. You've spent 30 years building an empire, and now you have to figure out how to give it away without destroying everything you've accomplished. It's like trying to wrap a hurricane. Let's start with the fundamental problem. You have multiple sons, and according to Frankish tradition, they're all entitled to inherit portions of your kingdom. This worked fine when your kingdom was basically a collection of tribes that could be split up like a pizza at a college party. But you're no longer just the king of the Franks. You're the Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of an integrated empire that stretches from the Atlantic to the Danube. How do you divide the Roman Empire? It's like trying to split up Amazon into separate companies while maintaining the same level of efficiency, integration, and market dominance. The whole point of your empire is that it's unified, standardized, and systematically integrated. Cut it into pieces, and you don't get 3 smaller empires. You get 3 kingdoms that will immediately start fighting each other. The year is 806, and you're sitting in your palace at Aachen, looking at a map of your empire and trying to figure out how to solve an impossible equation. Your sons are Louis, Pepin, and Charles, 3 competent men who have been trained in warfare, administration, and imperial governance. Any one of them could probably run a kingdom successfully, But can any of them run your empire? And more importantly, can they run it together? The room smells like parchment, cold stone, and the particular mustiness that comes from spending too much time indoors thinking about problems that have no good solutions. Your advisors are gathered around the table, each one trying to look wise, while secretly hoping you'll figure this out on your own. Because everyone knows that whatever succession plan you choose, it's going to create more problems than it solves. The Frankish tradition of partible inheritance, dividing the kingdom among all legitimate male heirs, had worked for centuries when the Franks were just another Germanic tribe. But you're not ruling a tribe anymore. You're ruling an empire with integrated administrative systems, standardized currency, unified legal codes, and economic networks that span the entire continent. Split that up, and you're essentially dismantling the greatest governmental achievement of the medieval world. But here's the really infuriating part. You can't just ignore Frankish tradition and create a system of primogeniture where the eldest son inherits everything. Your entire political legitimacy is based on being the rightful king of the Franks. And if you start throwing out Frankish customs whenever they're inconvenient, you're essentially admitting that your imperial authority is more important than your ethnic identity. It's like being the CEO of a multinational corporation while also being the head of a family business. Corporate logic says you should choose the most qualified successor and give them complete control. Family logic says you should treat all your children fairly and give them equal opportunities. Try to do both, and you end up satisfying no one. Your first attempt at solving this problem was the Divisio Regnorum, the division of the kingdom, which you announced in 806. It was a carefully crafted document that tried to split your empire into 3 roughly equal parts while maintaining some level of cooperation between your sons. Louis would get Aquitaine and the Spanish Marches, Pepin would get Italy and Bavaria, and Charles would get the core Frankish territories. On paper, it looked reasonable. In practice, it was a recipe for civil war with a side order of imperial collapse. The problem wasn't just that you were dividing territory. You were dividing systems. Your currency system required central control to maintain standardization. Your administrative system depended on unified oversight from royal inspectors. Your military system relied on the ability to move troops quickly between different regions. Your legal system was based on empire-wide codes that required consistent enforcement. Divide your empire into 3 independent kingdoms, and all of these systems would either collapse or become sources of conflict between your sons. It would be like trying to run 3 separate internet companies while sharing the same servers, the same user database, and the same technical infrastructure. The first time they disagreed about anything, the entire system would crash. But you were also dealing with a problem that went beyond administrative logistics. The imperial title itself. You were the Holy Roman Emperor, but what did that mean for your successors? Could there be 3 Holy Roman Emperors? Could the title be divided like a kingdom? Or did imperial authority require a single ruler? The Church was no help with this question. Pope Leo III had crowned you emperor, but he died in 1816, and his successors were more interested in maintaining their own authority than in solving your succession problems. The Byzantine Empire was definitely not going to provide guidance on how to divide the Roman imperial title, and there was no precedent for how to handle the succession of a barbarian king who had also become Roman emperor. You were essentially making up the rules as you went along, which is terrifying when the rules you're making will determine the fate of European civilization for the next several centuries. The more you thought about it, the more you realized that the real problem wasn't figuring out how to divide your empire. It was accepting that your empire couldn't be divided. Everything you'd built was designed to work as a unified whole. Take away the unity, and you'd destroy the empire itself. This is where your story takes a dark turn. You started to understand that the empire you'd built was essentially a one-generation achievement. You could create it, you could run it, but you couldn't transfer it intact to your successors. It was like being an entrepreneur who'd built a company that was completely dependent on their personal leadership, vision, and relationships. The evidence was already mounting. Your sons were capable administrators, but they weren't you. They hadn't conquered the Saxons. They hadn't negotiated with the Pope. They hadn't built the administrative systems that held everything together. They'd grown up as imperial princes, not as self-made kings who had to fight for every inch of territory. More importantly, they didn't have the same relationships with the people who made your empire work. The counts who reported to you had fought alongside you in your campaigns. The bishops who supported you had been appointed by you personally. The merchants who used your currency trusted you because you'd proven that your word was good. None of that automatically transferred to your sons. By 810, 2 of your 3 sons were dead. Pepin died in 810, Charles died in 811, and suddenly your carefully planned succession strategy was obsolete. You were left with Louis, who was capable but had spent most of his career governing Aquitaine rather than learning to run an empire. The irony was devastating. You'd spent decades building an empire that was designed to last forever, but you'd never figured out how to make it survive your own death. You'd created administrative systems that could handle any crisis except the transition of power from one generation to the next. In 813, you made a decision that was both pragmatic and heartbreaking. You crowned Louis as co-emperor, essentially admitting that your empire would need to be simplified and centralized under a single ruler if it was going to survive. The Divisio Regnorum was quietly abandoned, and the dream of maintaining Frankish inheritance traditions while preserving imperial unity was officially dead. But even as you prepared Louis for succession, you knew that the empire he would inherit wouldn't be the same empire you'd built. It would be smaller, less integrated, more vulnerable to rebellion and external attack. The administrative systems would still work, but they'd be more fragile. The economic networks would still function, but they'd be more susceptible to disruption. The military would still be effective, but it would be less flexible. You'd created something magnificent, but you'd also created something that was essentially unrepeatable. Your empire was a product of your unique combination of military genius, administrative innovation, political skill, and historical circumstance. None of your successors would have the same opportunities, the same resources, or the same advantages. The question was, would what you'd built be strong enough to survive the transition? Or would your death mark the beginning of the end for the greatest empire Europe had seen since Rome? The answer would determine not just your legacy, but the entire future of European civilization. On January 28, 814, you died. Not in battle like a warrior king should. Not in some dramatic political crisis that would make for good television, but from a fever in your bed at Aachen. You'd spent 30 years conquering Europe, building an empire, and reshaping civilization itself, and you went out like any other 72-year-old man in the Middle Ages, quietly, probably uncomfortably, and definitely not according to your own schedule. The irony is almost too perfect. You'd survived Saxon berserkers, Lombard conspiracies, papal politics, and your own family's attempts to kill you. only to be defeated by what was probably just a really bad cold. It's like being a legendary race car driver who dies in a fender bender in a grocery store parking lot. Your death set off exactly the kind of succession crisis you'd been dreading, Louis the Pious, and yes, that nickname tells you everything you need to know about why he wasn't cut out for this job. Inherited your empire with the best of intentions and absolutely none of the skills necessary to keep it together. It was like handing over a Formula One racing team to someone whose driving experience consisted of Sunday trips to church. Louis was a good man, which was precisely the problem. He believed in Christian virtue, fair treatment of his subjects, and the kind of moral leadership that works great in theory, but falls apart the moment someone starts shooting arrows at you. He inherited an empire that required constant military action, ruthless political maneuvering, and the kind of moral flexibility that would make a telemarketer uncomfortable. The empire held together for Louis's reign, but barely. It was like watching a luxury car that's been perfectly maintained by an expert mechanic being driven by someone who's never heard of oil changes. Everything still worked, but you could tell it wasn't going to last much longer. The real disaster came after Louis died in 8040. His three sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bold, immediately started fighting over who got what piece of the empire. It was like watching your carefully constructed Lego masterpiece being torn apart by toddlers who each wanted different colored blocks. The Treaty of Varden in 843 officially split your empire into 3 kingdoms. Lothair got the Middle Kingdom, which included Italy, the Low Countries, and the territory between the Rhine and the Rhone. Louis the German got the Eastern Territories, which would eventually become Germany. Charles the Bald got the Western Territories, which would become France. On paper, it looked like a reasonable division. In practice, it was the death certificate for your empire. Within a generation, your unified administrative system had collapsed into 3 competing bureaucracies. Your standardized currency had been replaced by regional coins that nobody trusted. Your empire-wide legal codes had been superseded by local laws that varied from kingdom to kingdom. The psychological impact was devastating. Your subjects had spent decades thinking of themselves as citizens of a unified Christian empire, heirs to Roman civilization, members of something greater than their local tribes or regions. Suddenly, they were just Germans or French, or Italians, fragmented peoples living in diminished kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than building anything worthwhile. The military consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Your integrated army, which had been the most effective fighting force in Europe, was split into 3 smaller armies that regarded each other with suspicion. The defensive systems you'd built to protect your borders became useless when the borders themselves were constantly shifting. The rapid response capabilities that had made rebellion impossible became impossible when armies had to cross hostile territory to reach trouble spots. Your economic systems collapsed even faster than your military ones. The trade networks that had connected your empire from the Atlantic to the Danube were severed when your successors started treating each other's territories as foreign countries. Merchants who had operated across your entire empire suddenly found themselves dealing with customs duties, currency exchanges, and political barriers that made long-distance trade unprofitable. The educational system you'd built survived a little longer, but it became increasingly fragmented and localized. The schools still taught Latin, but they taught it with regional variations. The curriculum still included the classical texts you'd mandated, but they were interpreted through local cultural lenses. The shared intellectual culture that had bound your empire together gradually dissolved into regional academic traditions. But here's the thing about historical legacy. Sometimes the most important achievements are the ones that outlast their creators. Your empire died with you, but your innovations became the foundation for everything that came after. You didn't create a 1,000-year empire, but you created the ideas that would shape 1,000 years of European development. The Holy Roman Empire that emerged from the wreckage of your original empire lasted until 1806, exactly 1,000 years. It was never as unified, never as powerful, and never as innovative as what you'd built, but it carried your name and your basic concept of Christian imperial authority. It was like a cover band that played your greatest hits for a millennium, never quite matching the original, but keeping the music alive. Your administrative innovations became the template for European government. The concept of professional civil service, systematic oversight, merit-based advancement, and centralized financial control. All of these ideas that we take for granted in modern government can be traced back to your imperial reforms. You essentially invented the modern state funds 200 years before anyone else figured it out. Your educational system became the foundation for European intellectual life. The universities of medieval Europe were built on the schools you'd established. The Renaissance was made possible by the classical texts you'd preserved and the scholarly traditions you'd created. The scientific revolution happened because you taught Europeans to think systematically about knowledge and learning. Your economic innovations shaped European commerce for centuries. The concept of standardized currency, unified trade regulations, and systematic market development. All of these became standard practice in medieval Europe because you'd proven they worked. The commercial revolution that transformed Europe in the later Middle Ages was built on the economic infrastructure you'd created. Most importantly, you'd created something that was more durable than any political system, the idea of European unity. For the first time since Rome, you'd shown that the diverse peoples of Europe could be unified under a single government, a single culture, and a single set of values. Even when your empire collapsed, the memory of what you'd achieved remained. Every subsequent attempt to unify Europe, from Napoleon's continental system to Hitler's Third Reich to the modern European Union, has been, in some sense, an attempt to recreate what you accomplished. They've all failed to match your achievement, but they've all been inspired by your example. You didn't just build an empire, you built a dream that has haunted European politics for 200 years. The ultimate irony is that your greatest failure became your greatest success. You couldn't create an empire that would last forever, but you created the idea that such an empire was possible. You couldn't build institutions that would survive your death, but you built concepts that would outlive every political system that came after you. You set out to rebuild the Roman Empire, and you ended up creating something more important, the template for modern European civilization. Your empire lasted only one generation, but your influence shaped 30 generations of European development. Not bad for a barbarian king who couldn't even manage to die in battle. Looking back across 12 centuries, it's tempting to judge Charlemagne as a failure. After all, his empire collapsed immediately after his death. His successors couldn't maintain what he'd built, and his dream of a unified Christian Europe remained just that, a dream. But this perspective misses the profound truth about historical influence. The most important legacies are often the ones that outlast their creators' original intentions. Charlemagne didn't fail because his empire collapsed. He succeeded because his ideas survived. every concept that we associate with modern European civilization. Professional government, systematic education, unified economics, and the very possibility of continental unity can be traced back to his innovations. He didn't create a 1,000-year empire, but he created the intellectual and institutional foundations that made 1,000 years of European development possible. The European Union, for all its flaws and limitations, is essentially an attempt to achieve through economics and diplomacy what Charlemagne achieved through conquest and conversion. The idea that diverse European peoples can share common institutions, common values, and common identities remains as powerful today as it was in 800 AD. We're still trying to solve the same puzzle that Charlemagne solved: how to create unity without destroying diversity. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Charlemagne's legacy is how it transcends the usual categories of historical judgment. He was simultaneously a brilliant innovator and a brutal conqueror, a visionary leader and a pragmatic politician, a Christian emperor and a barbarian king. He embodied the contradictions of his age while pointing toward possibilities that wouldn't be fully realized for centuries. In the end, Charlemagne's true achievement wasn't building an empire. It was proving that building an empire was possible. He showed that the scattered, chaotic, primitive Europe of the early Middle Ages could be transformed into something unified, sophisticated, and enduring. The fact that his particular solution didn't last forever doesn't diminish the importance of his demonstration that solutions were possible. History is full of dreamers who imagined better worlds, and it's full of builders who created temporary achievements. Charlemagne was both: a dreamer whose vision outlasted his empire, and a builder whose innovations outlasted his institutions. That's not failure disguised as success. That's the rarest kind of historical achievement influence that grows stronger with time rather than weaker. The barbarian king who became an emperor, who became a legend, who became an idea that still shapes the world today. That's a legacy worth remembering.